Welcome, everyone. The first speaker of this session is Begona Vicente from the University of the Basque Country, and the presentation is titled Speaker Cancellation of Potential Implicatures, Discourse Structure and Relevance.
Okay, so in this talk, I explore the conditions that make a potential conversational implicature a pragmatically acceptable move, focusing on quantity inferences. I discuss the question and the discussion approach to speaker cancellation of scalar inferences as put forward by Mayol Castroviejo. And I show that to fine-tune its predictions, the QUD account requires a more general pragmatic theory, which, like RT, places context selection and processing effort at the center of utterance interpretation. Now, although all implicatures are by definition cancelable in Grecian terms, not all are felicitously speaker cancelable, because speaker cancellation of a potential implicature is a conversational move which is bound up with speakers' communicative intentions. It pertains to the situated act of speech, and it operates within the constraints of general pragmatic principles and arguably more specific discourse structure restrictions. And so, as we would expect, an attempt at speaker cancellation will be more or less felicitous, and to the extent that it will be, or the extent to which it will be, is inversely correlated with its strength. The more strongly communicated an implicature, the less speaker cancelable, where a contextual implication is a strong implicature if it must be derived for an interpretation to satisfy the hearer's expectation of relevance. Now, quantity inferences are interesting for exploring the conditions for felicitous speaker cancellation of implicatures, because although removing a potential implicature always leaves the content of the sentence unaffected, only in the case of quantity inference does the cancelling clause entail the content of the immediately preceding utterance. So why does the speaker choose to produce a weak item immediately followed by a stronger one that entails it if we exclude self-repair? Why not produce the stronger utterance if that's just what she wanted to communicate? Now, Mayol Castroviejo's proposal for this is the QUD constraint, and the general idea is that discourse structure, modeled in terms of the questions that utterances address, whether explicitly or implicitly formulated, determines when the cancellation of a scalar inference will be felicitously carried out. Now, crucially, following Roberts' 1996 in their proposal, a direct link is established between the focus of a sentence and the discourse topic viewed as the question and the discussion. Now, this is because in this discourse-oriented model, utterances and the questions they are an answer to must be congruent. Now, this is the constraint as they formulate it. The operation of cancelling presupposes a question and a discussion which is different from the last one or the current one. Now, this means that a scalar inference will not be felicitously cancelled when it addresses the current QUD as in one. So how many examples did you pass? I passed some of my exams. In fact, I passed all of them. The cancelling clause is not felicitous because it addresses the current question. How many exams did you pass? The same for two. How many cars do you have? I have 2 cars. In fact, I have 3 cars. Not felicitous because the in fact clause addresses the current question. How many cars do you have? In contrast, a cancelling clause introduced by in fact will be felicitous when it addresses a question and a discussion which is different from the current one. So who passed some of their exams? I passed some. Notice that the scalar is not in focus this time. In fact, I passed all of them. The cancelling clause does not address the current question, who, but a different one. How many exams did you pass? And the same applies to who has 2 cars. John has 2 cars. In fact, he has 3. There's a QUD shift in the cancelling clause to have how many cars do you have? So it does not address the current question, who has 2 cars. In addressing a new question and a discussion, in introducing a new topic of discourse, the felicitous cancelling clause moves the discourse forward. Now, one major strength of their proposal is that the QUD constraint correctly predicts that cancelling phrases will be barred from projective environments, such as presuppositions and conventional implicatures, precisely because they can't raise new questions under discussion as they contribute background information or side comments, that is non-at-issue content, to the discourse. So 5 is like 4 here, the numeral is not in focus, but this time the attempt at reorienting the discourse to a new question under discussion fails because the cancelling clause is embedded under the factive predicate surprise. Now, as in this kind of environment, new topics can't be introduced, the cancellation is not permissible. The KUD constraint can be shown to apply to all kinds of upper bound quantity inferences, not just lexical scalars. This applies to ad hoc scalars. Do you have tomatoes and onions for the soup? I have tomatoes. In fact, I have onions too. It's not felicitous because the in fact clause addresses the current question, do you have tomatoes and onions? In contrast, we need tomatoes and onions for the soup. Who has tomatoes? I have tomatoes. In fact, I have onions too. Whoops, sorry. Now, this time, the in fact clause does not address the current question, who has tomatoes, but a different one, and so it is felicitous. We find the same with exhaustify and inferences, which I'm going to skip, I'm afraid, in the interest of time. And it can also be applied to potential relevance implications, the KUD words, but I'm going to skip it, I'm sorry. Recapping on Mayol and Castroviejo's constraint, it predicts that when the weak scalar contributes content to the topic of this course, the last question under discussion as identified by focus, the cancellation of the scalar inference is not felicitous. Otherwise, the scalar inference is felicitously cancelled unless the scalar appears in a projective environment. And the function of the felicitous cancelling clause, the reason why it is reasonable to cancel a quantity inference, is to reorient the discourse towards a new topic, thus moving it forward. Now, Mayol and Castroviejo's constraint correctly captures the fact that for a quantity inference to be speaker cancelable, the context must be lower bound. That is, the utterance must be relevant as expected without the quantity inference. However, whether a context is lower or upper bound, and so whether a scalar inference makes the utterance relevant as expected, is often determined by assumptions available in the wider context, rather than solely by the question an utterance is an answer to. So consider 12 and 13. You're looking worried, some problems have arisen, in fact, all. Now, notice this time the scalar does not bear a narrow focus, it's only part of sentence focus, but still the in fact clause, the cancelling clause, addresses that current implicit question, why are you looking worried? So it is infelicitous. However, the exact same sequence, we could say structurally anyway, you're looking worried, some students have tested positive, this time it's not so clear that the cancelling clause is not acceptable. Now, Mayol and Castroviejo's constraint does not tell us why there is this difference in acceptability of the cancelling clauses, which is connected, in fact, to the contextual assumptions available to speakers at the time of the exchange. In particular, 3 contextual assumptions must be satisfied for the scalar inference to be derivable, and so indirectly for a specific discourse sequence to allow speaker cancellation: the salient step condition, the epistemic condition, and the full cooperation condition. Now, the salient step condition requires that for the scalar inference to be calculable, a contextually accessible set of X's, problems or students, must be available to participants. Now, this condition is met in 13A. Some students have tested positive, but not in 12A. Some problems have arisen. And so the scalar inference is not even potential in this case, which accounts for why we find the cancelling clause so clearly anomalous. Now, the epistemic condition tells us that the speaker must be informed about the whole set of relevant cases where the SI should be derived. So think of how many Tory MPs have sent letters calling for the PM to resign. Some have, in fact, they may all have. Several say they will not reveal whether they have. Now, this time, the scalar is in focus. The cancelling clause addresses the current question, how many Tory MPs have sent letters, but because it is obvious that the speaker is not knowledgeable, the scalar inference does not go through, and cancellation is felicitous. Now, finally, the full cooperation condition applies to cases where speaker preferences are key in the derivation of effects. This is clause B of the presumption of optimal relevance. So in an exchange, like how many of your friends have downtime, some have, in fact, all have. Again, we have focus on the scalar. The in fact clause addresses the current question, how many of your friends have downtime, but in this kind of context, the speaker is sort of allowed not to be maximally informative. And so the scalar inference is not necessarily derived, which makes the cancellation permissible. Now, if the QD constraint was all there is to speaker cancelability of a scalar inference, the cancellations we've seen should not be admissible, but they are. Now, it could be argued that insofar as these conditions are prerequisites on the scalar inference arising, the QD constraint should be understood to apply only when these contextual conditions are satisfied. But even when these conditions are satisfied, the availability of specific contextual assumptions may be shown to override Mayol Castroviejo's constraint. Now, consider that the discourse sequence in 16. Parents with at least 3 children have free entrance. How many children do the Peters have? They have 3. Focus on the numeral. It's all right. In fact, 4. Felicitous cancellation, although the numeral in 16a is in focus, and there is no shift in question and the discussion that the in fact clause addresses. We'll come back to this example. So by Mayol and Castroviejo's criterion, cancellation should be infelicitous, but that's not what we find. Now, clearly, the QUD constraint on cancelling is subject to more general contextual relevance conditions, which may override its predictions for a specific question-answer discourse sequence. And more specifically, the role that focus plays in the derivation of a scalar inference appears to be less restrictive than is assumed in Mayol and Castroviejo's account, in that it does not determine what question is actually being addressed by a particular afference, nor does it necessarily trigger a scalar inference for a scalar term. And so to fine-tune Mayol and Castroviejo's cancelability predictions, we need to connect focus with processing effort, as is done in relevance theory. Now, the relevance theory perspective, as we know, the informative strength that the addressee is entitled to expect of an utterance, which includes a weak expression, is regulated, like all inferential aspects of utterance interpretation, by the cognitive tendency to balance effects obtained and effort spent when processing a ostensive stimulus. This means that in relevance theory, the effort factor has to be integrated as part of an account of quantity inference derivation and speaker cancelability. Now, to see how the effort factor may affect speaker cancelability of a potential scalar inference, consider the type of lower bound context in 17. Were some pizzas delivered? Some pizzas were delivered, in fact, all. The reply in 17a provides the amount of information that A had explicitly requested and therefore signaled as the level of relevance he expected of B's reply. B is therefore justified in not considering the more informative answer, all the pizzas were delivered, relevant to A at this point in the exchange, and so the scalar inference is not communicated. the potential scalar inference not being communicated, the speaker is free to cancel it in the next utterance. On the other hand, in the type of upper bound case in 18a, where all the pictures delivered, some pictures were delivered, in fact all, both marked stress and failure to reuse the stronger term already in the question would produce a contrastive effect and would most likely prompt the strengthening of the scalar to balance out the greater processing cost incurred. Now, in this type of upper bound case, context, the scalar inference would not be felicitously cancelled because the question by A is only relevantly answered if the scalar inference is computed. The addressee is therefore generally justified in assuming that the scalar inference is intended as an actual implicature of the utterance and as such not felicitously speaker cancelled. Now, the difference in the interpretation of these two examples and their behaviour with respect to speaker cancellation shows that departures from neutral or expected prosody prompt the derivation of additional effects to offset the phonological effort that contrastive stress demands of the addressee. More generally, intonational prominence, even if not contrastive, has an important role to play in guiding interpretation as an effort-saving mechanism, just like other procedural elements. More specifically, the function of focal stress is to indicate to the addressee that the question the utterance is an answer to, or the corresponding assumption schema, is the source of contextual assumptions that will lead to the intended contextual effects. Excuse me. Now, relevance considerations connecting focus and processing effort can shed light on the difference in acceptability of speaker cancellation of a scalar inference. Excuse me. So back to example 4. In relevance theory terms, the scalar inference in 19c is likely not derived as intended because the addressee is not expected to spend processing effort on the numeral, as focal stress on the subject indicates this is where it's worth dwelling for the intended effects. In contrast, in 20, on the other hand, focal stress in the numeral prompts the derivation of effects associated with the numeral, and so the scalar inference is more likely derived as intended, making its cancellation infelicitous. However, not all utterances where the weaker term is in focus and could be described as directly addressing the current UD happen in upper bound context in which the scalar inference is not speaker cancelable, as we've seen. If we go back to 21, how many children do the Peters have? They have 3, it's all right, in fact 4. As 21a allows the derivation of the implicature, the Peters can have free entrance, the search for additional effects that might otherwise follow from the weak scalar being intonationally salient will not be considered worth the effort. And as predicted of implications that are potential but have not been communicated, the possibility of cancellation is available to the speaker. Excuse me. Now, these examples are not problematic for the RT account because it is not committed to focus having one specific type of effect, the scalar inference. And so there's no a priori expectation that the scalar inference should arise whenever the weaker expression is in focus. Now, in examples where the scalar is in focus and all that is provided as context is a congruent explicit question, the easiest choice for intended effect is the scalar inference. But if, as in 21, other assumptions available in the context interact with the unenriched scalar and yield cognitive effects, the relatively extra effort of processing focus would already be made up for, and the scalar inference will not be considered. Still, as a potential implication of the utterance, it will be available for speaker cancellation. This shows that linking prosodic prominence of a scalar to accessibility of contextual assumptions, the yield expected cognitive effects, can account both for cases when a scalar inference will be communicated and when it won't, and indirectly for when it will be felicitous to cancel it and when it won't. Now, for Mayol Castroviejo is constrained to accommodate these cases where the scalar bears narrow focus and the scalar inference is cancelable. The reply that contained in the cancellation would have to be addressing the superordinate question in 21. Do the Peters have at least 3 children? So that the cancelling clause could be described as a shift in question under discussion. How many exactly? However, to take this on board, Mayol and Castroviejo would have to give up on the direct link they assume between focus and question under discussion, which makes their model principal. Finally, Mayol and Castroviejo said that their QUD constraint on cancellation is pragmatic in nature and accounts for preferences in acceptability rather than categorical judgments, as their own empirical study on scalar inference cancelability shows. However, they say nothing about what can explain this variability they find, nor can they account for the cases we've discussed. The suggestion here is that adopting a more broad-based pragmatic theory that gives context selection and processing effort the key role that they play in all things pragmatic, including the questions that utterances may be shown to address, is the way forward. And I think I'll stop here because I've used up all my time. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So if you have any question, you can raise your hand. Anne? No, sorry, I saw a hand. Yes, Daniel.
Yeah, in that case then. Thank you very much, Begoña. I hate to ask you a question immediately before I would also be looking to present, but I'm a fan of your work, and I also like very much the general direction, which is that if you dig deeper into some of these formal semantic and formal pragmatic approaches to information structure, in the end, you end up realizing that it always comes back to relevance and processing effort. I'm interested if you would be able to say something about the QUD approach in general, and what you meant, how you mentioned that it, in certain cases, it becomes clear, at least for the analyst, you say, wondering if you have something to say about the kind of criticism that the QUD approach has come under for the kind of circularity of reasoning. That they know it is the question under discussion because they know it is, and that's how they know it is, right? Yeah.
Well, the thing is, I had that in my conclusion. This constraint on cancellation works well when the question that is actually being addressed, when you have a scalar which bears narrow focus, and when the question that is actually being addressed is the question explicitly given, or the one that corresponds with focus. So in those sort of narrow kind of contexts, as when there's nothing else, and the two parameters like narrow focus on the scalar and cancellation clause addressing another question, those cases they get right. And it's interesting how the explanation they give for projective environments, that's really nice. In those cases, it works. But the thing is, context overrides those assumptions, and that happens all the time. So, and they're aware of it in question under discussion, because I've got friends working in that framework, and they're aware of it. They're aware that context comes in to determine what question is actually being answered or addressed. It's just that they do not take the leap to a more, they say beliefs and intentions have to be taken into account, but they do not take the leap to a more general pragmatic theory, which could use their insights. They do have very interesting things to say, but I think the problem is, as you pointed out, that their view of context, their view of focus is too narrow. And so it works only for the cases they more or less not so much stipulate, but which is like toy example, so to speak, I think. No, that's what I can tell you.
I have a question, actually. We have a few minutes, so I can ask it. I was wondering what you think about the relationship between the notion of speaker cancellation that you talked about and deniability. I've seen at the beginning that you were mentioning the work of Sternau that has actually to do with deniability and not speaker cancellation. I was wondering the extent to which you think what you have said applies to deniability as well, or whether there's some interesting distinction that needs to be made.
Yeah, okay. I did think a lot about deniability. Deniability is again a speech act. So, it's not so. I think it's used in different ways. One is to when talking about scope of negation, and that's a formal notion. At other times, it's used as a speech act. I did an awful lot of thinking about that one. I'm sorry, I don't think I can tell you anything now. Are you using a deniability as equivalent to cancellability, as interchangeable?
Well,
I read stuff by you.
At least not in the way in which you were using cancellation here, because, for instance, you talk about cancellation in examples like your example 17, in which you could cancel an inference that was not an implicature, that was actually not communicated to begin with. And you describe these cases as cases of felicitous cancellation. And so in this sense, you know, when we talk about deniability, typically we want to deny having had the intention to communicate an implicature that went through, that was communicated, but we want to retract.
Yeah. Yeah, but if you see that's a different kettle of fish. If you want to retract, that's self-repair. That's not so. I mean, we can decide how we use our terms, but if you retract, you're taking away the asserted content. So self-correction is a slightly different type of phenomenon from. So you can of course call all of it cancellation, no problem, but it's interesting to make a distinction between cancellation and self-repair or correction, where the asserted content is taken out, and these uses are more emphatic. Corrections are more emphatic than in speaker cancellations, at least for quantity inferences. You're more informative because you think at this stage you can add to the you can make the discourse move on to a new thing, and you're contributing more information. You're not taking away anything. You're just pushing the discourse forward. I think I would be okay with that, I think. But yeah, I forget. I did an awful lot of thinking about deniability and how it's used, and I forget now. Yeah, sorry, yeah.
Okay. I think we can move to the second speaker of this session.
Yeah, sorry.
Thanks. Thank you very much.